Hi, I'm Faye from Studio Jepson. Welcome along to your online tutorial. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make this beautiful fabric advent calendar kit. It has 24 pockets for you to fill with treats or notes or ideas of things that you can do together as a family. What are you going to need for this tutorial? You're going to need your kit that's available from studiojepson.com that contains the panel, the wadding, the binding and the backing fabric. You're going to need an iron, a basic sewing kit and a sewing machine. I'm also going to be showing you a pretty nifty trick using bondable yarn that's also available from studiojepson.com. So what are we waiting for? Let's get started.
Let's begin by opening our bucket. We have our cotton panel, two little squares that you're going to attach the back to insert your baton. We have the backing cotton piece and the wadding. So take your actual cotton advent calendar panel out, lay it flat on your table, and we're going to cut all 24 of the pockets following the dashed grey line. Now, if these were all completely lined up with no spaces, I'd probably use a rotary cutter, but as you can see, there's little gaps in between the pockets. So I've chosen to use sewing scissors here. I'm taking care to ensure that the bottom part of my blade is in contact with the table as I cut. This makes sure there's nice, clean, confident strokes, and please don't be tempted to cut in the air. That will not leave you with nice square pieces and rectangular pieces to attach to your advent calendar. Once all 24 of your pockets are cut out, it's time to finish the edges. You'll notice on the white pockets that they don't have a marked seam allowance, so I like to add this now before I get to the iron. I use a ruler, and in this case I'm using a friction pen, but you could also use chalk or a pencil to mark your seam allowance so that when you get to the iron, you know where you're going to be pressing your seam allowance. So once your pocket is pressed, it's going to look a little something like this. So head over to your iron and follow the visible seam allowance. On this pocket I'm using a blue pocket so you can see the white area seam allowance, and just use your iron to turn this seam allowance under. Take care not to burn yourself and make sure you've got a nice crisp press. I find the better the pressing, the easier the sewing. So I'm just going to show you a little detail here where I want to mitre the corners. This is just like when you wrap a present. Can you see that I'm folding the corners in so they're at a 45-degree angle? This just ensures that the seam allowance isn't going to poke out when you come to sew your pocket on, and it's just a nice little detail really that I think will elevate your finish. And there's your completed pocket ready to pin and sew onto your advent calendar. So sitting down at our machine, I'm about to stitch the top edge of the pocket. I'm threaded up with white cotton, and I'm going to move my needle position over so that I'm getting nice and close to the top edge of the pocket. I'm sewing here with a 7mm seam allowance, and I've moved my needle position over to the right to achieve that 7mm seam allowance. But as long as you're catching the top edge of the pocket, whatever seam allowance you want to stitch this top stitch in is absolutely fine. Just make sure that you're reversing at the beginning and the end of the pocket, and what we're actually going to do is stitch this in a chain. So you can see here that I'm stitching my first pocket. My stitch line is 7mm from that top pocket edge, and I've reversed at the beginning and the end of the pocket. You'll notice now that I'm just going to carry on stitching. I haven't cut my thread. I just let the foot go over to the next pocket and reverse and keep stitching. I find this really speeds the process of stitching all 24 pockets up by quite a lot. The reason we're reversing at the beginning and the end of the pocket is to make sure that this top stitch doesn't come undone. So repeat this process for all 24 pockets and you will be left with a great big whopping long chain of pockets sewn like bunting. The next thing to do is to take a small pair of snips and trim your thread ends and cut your chain into the 24 individual pockets. So I'm applying all of the pockets onto the advent calendar, and I'm taking care to make sure that that white seam allowance isn't poking out. You can finish these pockets in two ways. You can either pin each pocket onto the panel and just get straight on your machine and stitch them on, or you can do what I do, which is pin them on and then tack them. So I've taken a contrast colour thread and I've added a couple of knots at the end of that thread to ensure that it doesn't pull loose, and I'm just going to quickly do some hand tacking to attach each of the pockets in place. I love the process of tacking. I think it's really tactile anyway, but I always include this step because it means that my pockets are going to end up in the right place without any shifting or wobbling, and I can just focus on the stitch position, not where the pockets themselves are when I come to sew. Now is about the time I like to go and get a cup of tea. I've now got all 24 of my pockets tacked in place, and I'm really happy with that position. It's looking lovely. So now it's time to stitch. We're actually going to use a much smaller seam allowance than we did before. That's what I like to do when it comes to attaching the pockets. And I'm going to use my favourite foot. This is known as an edge joining foot. Can you see it's got a little metal tab? And that metal tab will sit up against the outside of the pocket and it will allow me to get super close to the edge of my pocket. Now, if you don't have one of these feet, don't worry. Use your regular feet and you move your needle over as we did before. Just move that needle as close as you can get to the edge of the pocket, ensuring that you can get a nice consistent stitch. I've attached my foot and I'm going to get sewing. So I'm using a 2mm seam allowance here. Critically important, do not forget to reverse at the beginning and the end of each pocket. These little pockets are going to get a lot of hammering with little hands grabbing for chocks and all the other wonderful treats you're going to put inside, so they need to be sturdy. So let's make sure that we're reversing at the beginning and the end of our stitch, and let's take our time, because we want to get as close to the edge of that pocket as possible and it to be a nice neat stitch. So you can just see here that I'm doing a nice straight stitch all the way to the bottom of the pocket. Now when I come to 2mm from the pocket edge, I drop my needle, lift my foot, turn my work. I'm then going to carry on sewing until I get to 2mm from the edge of the pocket again, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. This will help me get a nice crisp corner rather than rounding off those edges. So keep stitching until you get 2mm from the edge of the pocket. Drop the needle, lift the foot, turn your work, and it's as simple as that. It's a lengthy process because there's 24 pockets, but just repeat that same process for each one of the pockets, making sure you reverse at the beginning and the end of your pocket. Just as an FYI, I always sew pockets on in this way individually rather than just pivoting here and going back down to the next pocket. I think it leaves a neater finish and it's easier in my opinion. And there you go, there's your finished pocket. Oh, these pockets are looking really great and I'm so happy with this as how it's coming along. We're now going to cut the panel from the main fabric. So using rotary cutter or scissors, cut along the dashed line by the thick grey line. Now it's time to cut up our wadding to size. So lay your advent calendar on top of your wadding, smooth it out, make sure you've got no air bubbles underneath it, and we're going to pin this in place. I use quite a lot of pins here to make sure that I'm getting it correct with no air bubbles. And then once that's pinned in place, cut the wadding down to the size of the panel. So as we did before, we're now going to use this advent calendar, as a pattern piece again. So lay your advent calendar panel on top of your large pink piece of fabric. Smooth it out, make sure there's no air bubbles, and pin it in place. Then we're going to cut around the edge of the advent calendar again, so it's all the same size. You can use a rotary cutter or scissors for this job. Take care, make sure there's no air bubbles, no creases, and it's lovely and smooth and flat. Now we're going to flip our advent calendar over and we're going to do the corner section which holds your baton in place. So take your two little squares and we're going to fold them, aligning two of the edges so that you're ended up with a folded triangle. We're going to take them over to the iron and we're going to press them in place. Once they're pressed, pop them in the corners like so, aligning each corner of the advent calendar panel with the corner of the triangle, and pin in place. We're then going to tack all the way around the advent calendar, ensuring that we secure these corners at the same time. Looking a little something like this now. It's really taking shape, and we've got one more stage to do. I've tacked all the way around the edges. I've made sure that my tacking has caught those corner pieces, and I'm ready to attach my binding now. So I want to talk to you about this product. This is Prym Fusible bonding yarn, and it's amazing. It's a really sneaky hack that means when you come to attach your binding, if you put this in your bobbin, when you flip your binding over and press it, it bonds your binding in place, meaning you don't have to hand sew. So I absolutely love this thread. You pop it in your bobbin, and can you see here, this is a previous example, when I flipped my binding over and pressed it, it's bonded that binding in place. I have not hand sewn that piece there at all. It's securely in place. You will notice that this yarn is a bit thicker than your usual sewing thread. It's an adhesive bonding yarn, and as such, because it's a bit of a fancy yarn, I always hand wind this onto my bobbin rather than using the bobbin function on my machine. I find that my machine copes with it better if I do it this way. So you can see I'm just gently hand winding on, but I am applying some tension so that it isn't really loosey-goosey in the bobbin. Once that bobbin's full, I then thread up my machine as normal. If you aren't sewing with this bondable fusing yarn, then you can carry on with your machine threaded as before. So we're going to move on to the binding now. Now I know some of you are going to want to pin all of this in place. Trust me, it's better not to. You'll always end up with a bit of excess you weren't expecting. So just open out your binding, and we're just going to pin the first few centimetres. Can you see I'm placing the right side to the right side of my advent calendar? We're going to stitch in the ditch. So here I am, I'm just threading up my fusible bobbin here. Just pop that in the bobbin casing, and I'm going to get sewing. So I'm stitching in the ditch of this binding, but I'm going to leave the first, say, 4 or 5 centimetres of the binding unstitched. This is so that we can join the binding when we've gone all the way around the advent calendar. So just align the raw edges of your advent calendar with the outside edge of the binding, and we're going to very carefully stitch in that creased ditch of the binding. So make sure you reverse at the beginning, as always, and just take your time to stitch in the ditch of the binding. It's important we take our time here so that it's nice and even and consistent around the advent calendar. Stitch all the way down until you approach the corner. So I carry on stitching down to the corner, and then I'm going to stop when I'm equidistant from that edge that I've just sewn to the new corner as I'm turning. So you can see that I'm going to stitch down at a 45-degree angle, where you can see I'm dropping that pin for you. So I'm going to get to where I need to stop. I do a few more stitches to stop there where that pin just went in, and then I'm going to tail off at a 45-degree angle like I'm mitering this binding. So I'm going to drop my needle, and then I'm going to lift my foot, and then I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to stitch down at that 45-degree angle, and I'm going to reverse. I'm then going to lift my needle and trim my thread, and I'm going to fold the binding back on itself. As you can see, that leaves a lovely mitered finish. Don't panic if you think I'm going too fast. I'm going to show you this more than once. So once that first piece is stitched, I fold my bias binding back up towards the next edge. And can you see that creates like a fold that lines up with the edge we've just sewn? I'm then going to pop a pin into the binding and through the advent calendar so I can work out where my stitches stopped, so that where my next line of stitching needs to start. I then get a pencil, and I always mark this because we want to get as close as possible to get a beautiful mitered corner. So I'm just using my pencil here to mark that pin position. The reason it's important we get nice and close is otherwise you won't get a nice mitre, and you might even have a hole. So take your time with this step. If you need to sort of keep looking what's happening, if this is the first time you've done it, then by all means do so. So once you've started that stitching, make sure you reverse. You're then going to carry on all the way down the next edge, and here we are approaching the second corner. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to stitch until we are in a position equidistant from the edge of the where we're stitching down from the edge of the calendar to the next edge. Drop our needle, turn our work, stitch off at a 45-degree angle. We're then going to fold the bias binding back along the new edge. This will create a little fold at the corner. It's kind of like wrapping a present, really. Then we're going to drop on our pin into our bias binding so we can work out where our stitch row ended. Open up and have a look if you need it, because what we want to do is carry on that row of stitching. I'm going to mark it with a pencil so that I know I'm starting stitching at the exact point I need to, and then I'm going to stitch. If you need to, you can always drop your needle just to make sure you're in the right position before you actually start stitching. And then we're going to carry on, reverse at the beginning of those row of stitches, carry on along the third row until we get to the next corner. Now we're going to finish all the corners on that exact same way, and then we are going to get along that fourth edge where we need to join our binding. So I'm opening both my pieces of binding out, and I'm just finding the point at where they meet, and then putting a little crease. That's where the two pieces of binding meet, but of course you need seam allowance. I'm using a 5mm seam allowance, so I'm just trimming that there. You've got to make sure you've got enough to actually sew this together. If you want greater than 5mm, then take a greater seam allowance. I like to keep it nice and wee so that it's lovely and snug fitting to my advent calendar. So I'm just going to align those two cut edges now. If you'd rather sew before you cut, by all means do so. It's probably a good way to assess it. And then I'm just going to stitch that in place. So I'm using a 5mm seam allowance. I'm making sure that I reverse at the beginning and the end of my row of stitches, and I'm just going to secure that binding in place. So you can see that binding is now stitched, and I can now finish sewing that hole that's now left. So make sure that you start a centimetre before your last row of stitches ended. Don't forget to reverse at the beginning and the end of your row of stitches and just close that hole up. So you can see now that the binding is one continuous piece, and I can show you my mitered corners. So flip your binding over. We're ready for the last step. So finishing touches, I'm just going to very quickly double check I've got no tacking in, and just remove the tacking from my pockets, and also the tacking that was holding the three sandwich layers together. I'm just going to remove that, and then I'm going to head over to the iron. So I'm going to bring my binding over to the back of my advent calendar panel. I'm working with a medium iron, and I'm going to apply heat to that binding for about 10 to 15 seconds. I always start with the medium heat and start at 10 seconds and then see how I get on. As I approach the corner, I'm going to fold and miter that corner exactly how I would if I was wrapping a present. So just press your binding into the corner so you get that lovely 45-degree, and then use your iron to secure it in place. Now, this is the technique to finish this binding if you're using the fusible yarn. If you're using standard thread, then we need to hand stitch this binding in place. Oh, I'm so happy with my mitered corner. I hope yours are looking as nice. So if we haven't used the fusible yarn, we need to hand stitch this in place. And to do so, I've taken some white thread. I've popped a couple of knots at the end of the thread so that it doesn't come loose. And I'm just doing some very dainty little stitches through the pink backing fabric, the wadding, and then into the binding. This is not visible from the right side. We're not stitching all the way through. And actually, when I get down to the corner, I'm going to do a couple of little stitches on top of that binding to make sure that that mitre stays beautifully in place. So just work your way around the entire panel. Once I've stitched all 4 sides and I'm ready to secure my stitching, I stitch into my binding and make a loop and sew through the loop. Stitch into the binding, create a loop, sew through the loop. I do that 2 or 3 times and that will secure my hand stitching in place. I'm now going to hang my advent calendar. You can use wooden dowling like this from B&Q. I have a piece of bamboo from the garden which will fit perfectly, so I'm going to use that. Your advent calendar is now ready for you to hang and enjoy. Well done.
As always, if you have any questions, please drop a comment below or send me a DM. I'm always here to help, and I can't wait to see all of your finished advent calendars.